Hello, beautiful community. We are going to take ourselves a bit more slowly and a bit more intimately and a bit more in depth into what we touched on more staccato style in the main channel video yesterday. And it's about 8 or 9 in the evening here in the UK, and I'm just up, which is the kind of the way it works with my health condition when I sort of go overboard trying to get something done. But I'm delighted to be well enough to sit up here with you, and I invite you into this much more gentle and slow conversation. And all I really want to do together with you is go through the 4 or 5 things I said at the end about the consequences of the elimination of Prigozhin and just give those a bit more depth and context. But before, let's say 2 things, and I'm sorry if I'm slow and I mix up words in this chat. Which I also did in the video yesterday, by the way. I confused a few things, including polonium and Novichok. But before we go to these 5 points, let's say a couple of things. One about Putin's quite remarkable speech after Prigozhin's death, and one about the aesthetization of evil. Now, there are going to be people who are Prigozhin fans who are going to be very sad about his death, but there are also going to be people who understand that Prigozhin is an evil doer, but they also are a bit conflicted about his death. And not that many people might feel that in this community, but a lot of people who are anti-Russia will still feel it a bit, anti-Russia in this war. Why? And the answer is the aesthetization of evil. You don't really aesthetize Putin's evil because, I mean, what do you see? You see apartment blocks hit. You see a degenerated tyrant in his bunker keeping a lot of his previous skills, but then they're now strained increasingly by pathologies of isolation, delusion, grandiosity, much more than they were before. But Prigozhin is different. Prigozhin is a practitioner of the image of the cult of death, but also a practitioner of the cult of death, of violence as it ended itself in practice too, not just in image. And to that extent, he looks like a baddie in a soap. And when the baddie from your soap disappears, you kind of feel, oh, where is he gone? I liked him. And this is not a joke. This is a serious problem that humans always have with the tendency to aestheticize evil, to give it a kind of transcendence, to give it a kind of poetry. That's an error that is the polar opposite of another error, which is to see all evil as banal. Most evil is banal, but the instigators of evil are creative, entrepreneurial, industrious, imaginatively brilliant. They blend extraordinary gifts and disturbing pathologies. So they ain't banal, right? Prigozhin isn't banal, and Putin isn't banal at all, for that matter. But just like we do the banalization excessively, so we do the aesthetization excessively. And that's a dangerous delusion that we're tempted into, right? We, of course, know it from literature, right? We are terribly attracted to the extraordinarily sort of dark or subterranean characters than they are to 2+2 goody two-shoes folks. I'm being a bit facetious now, but that's enough to register the point. This is a separate conversation worth having, the aesthetization of evil. But what I'm saying is, there's a lot of people who don't like Prigozhin. They're going to feel a tiny bit torn about his death, and the explanation is this. Now, Putin's speech. It was different to his speech about the mutiny in the middle of the mutiny. In the middle of the mutiny, he felt rage at Prigozhin. And of course, this is deep political betrayal in Putin's eyes. Prigozhin, if not recently, then years back, was very close to Putin, innermost of the inner circle. And Putin just cannot handle that. He can handle neither the reality that people sometimes do this, nor the reality of a world in which people do this. And that people do this is inevitable in dynamics of high power in mafia-like regimes. But he had gone through a kind of traumatic process of cutting Prigozhin out over these weeks. And this conversation after Prigozhin's death was no longer visceral about Prigozhin. It's rather that he drew a kind of a line or a zipper across his life, and now he's in the post-Prigozhin stage, and Prigozhin doesn't come into that anymore. So when Putin was saying Prigozhin did this well, he did that well, we knew each other, blah, 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 this was all empty. It was dead. It was dead wood, just dead words. He simply sort of cut him out completely. So that was quite interesting. It wasn't an emotionally involved and conflicted speech. Look at what somebody so close to me did to me now. It was, I am fully insulated from this person now, and nothing sort of raises the gauge. It's all 000. It's all gone now. He has been zipped into a past life that has no connection with my current one. The 5 points that I made at the end. And this is really very important. It's unoriginal, this point, but it's absolutely essential. You've got to think about this event, Prigozhin being blown up in the sky, as an expression of a conflict inside the Putin regime, an intra-elite conflict, that is a suppressed conflict that keeps getting intermittently expressed in various ways. And Prigozhin's outbursts and his mutiny and then this are all manifestations of that sort of coming out. The conflict is between what I call the Freeze the War Party and the Militarized Society and Escalate the War Party. And I said a little bit about that in the main channel video. It's worth adding, however, that it's an interesting thing trying to place Putin in this conflict, right? So if you've got on the one hand the story of freezing the war, of perhaps a low level rather than perhaps a stopped war, but either, possibly, a stopped war, a low-level war going on for a few years, a large part of Russian society still going on as though it doesn't much affect them. No more escalation, maybe even a little de-escalation. And that is the sort of breather party. That's not a party that admits that anything wrong has been done, really, or that there needs to be talk about wrong things having been done. Not at all. It's just a party that says, well, let's now play this down a bit and cool this off a bit. Right? That's one party. The other party says, let's escalate, let's militarize society, and let's go for something closer to a all-encompassing war rather than a sort of war with one foot in, one foot out. The reason it's hard to place Putin is that Putin is obviously, today, overwhelmingly on the pause side. But if you follow my analysis, you also know that Putin is on the escalating side too. And the cartoonish way in which we might bridge that is that Putin hopes for the possibility to escalate later while being convinced that he shouldn't escalate and cannot escalate now. And that's partly predicated on a special theory about the weakness of the West, the cessation of Western support for Ukraine, the demise of Western democracies. So, in a certain sense, Putin, in executing Prigozhin, is punching the all-encompassing war camp, while himself thinking that over time he may need to inevitably move toward joining it. And this cartoonish picture is, I think, helpful to see. There is the pause versus total war, whatever you want to label it, tension. It's rarely explicit. And Putin is in the pause camp with a view that he's got to move to the total war camp over time in order to both fulfill his mission and realize his conception of regime stability. The second thing I said was about stabilization. I said that many analysts have argued that removing Prigozhin has rather stabilized the Putin regime, and I think in a certain sense this speaks past the direction in which our focus should go. And that's that the Russian regime is in a kind of downward spiral toward more and more instability and gradual erosion, very gradual, but nevertheless erosion of the monopoly over organized violence. And that is something that is accelerated virtually by whatever the regime does. Getting rid of Prigozhin accelerates it, not getting rid of Prigozhin doesn't accelerate it. So the talk that a non-military plane, right, with Russians on it being shot down near Moscow improves the stability of the regime is, along this line of thought that I'm suggesting, implausible. And I think that's a helpful perspective to keep in mind, right? So I don't really think that you are helped by people saying all over the place, yeah, now this consolidates Putin's position a bit. No, it's a bit like saying that if you're drunk and you are swaying all over the place and you just avoid walking into a tree, that having avoided walking into a tree as somebody who's drunk 11 pints of beer, that stabilizes your position. No, I don't think that stabilizes your position. I'm sorry. So that's where I want us to go here. Now, the third point is war on Russian soil, which I'm not going to insist on too much with you because we've really talked about it endlessly. And when we talk about war on Russian soil, we do not just mean Ukraine doing more operations on Russian soil, which they increasingly will have to do if their counteroffensive yields modest results. What I'm really saying is that the war will move onto Russian soil in ways I can't predict. But it's right, we can't see it yet, but it's going to happen in all kinds of surprising ways. Now, I said something hyperbolic deliberately in the video, so it's worth me staying with it for a bit, if you will allow me. And I said there is a possibility, I'm not sure if that's verbatim or something like that, there is a possibility that at some point the war is only going to be on Russian soil, that it'll involve no Ukrainians, but only Russians and Russians. And that's an implausible picture. Why would I say that in the main channel video, where every word I give, perhaps except in the rushed video like yesterday's, but every word I give, I try to be very intentional about the fact that it's going to go into your stomach, and it's going to sit there not just for an hour or two, but it's going to leave a certain imprint, and it's got to be kind of morally and physically good for you. Otherwise, I shouldn't put it in. So why this exaggeration? Well, it's an exaggeration I would never make as an intellectual, but it is an exaggeration I make as a public intellectual, where my starting point isn't what's right, but ethically rebalancing some of the directions in which we might be tilting in the way we see the world. In my life, the first time I thought about this very consciously was in 2002, when somebody in kind of my academic world made a big shift from an intellectual to public intellectual. That was the British political thinker, political philosopher John Gray. And John wrote Straw Dogs in 2002, and I remember walking around in the philosophy department up and down the corridor, and every room I knocked on there was somebody there scandalized by the book, because there was a philosophy academic writing a book in which you could find repeated statements that he could not possibly believe himself. But they weren't lies, nor were they irresponsible. Because what John was doing in that excellent public intellectual book is saying, well, hang on, if we're just drifting upward on some question, kind of taking us and with real intentionality and care drifting us down with an exaggerated motion could rebalance us a bit, So, if you said to me, well, Vlad, cook me a vegetable broth, and I said, okay, well, per glass of vegetable broth that I'll give you, the liquid would have been infused by 20 chickpeas, right? And there's a broth I make with fennel and chickpeas. Chickpeas in a light vegetable broth give it a wonderful umami character, and it can almost make the whole thing kind of tea-like, like a tea with very strange flavors, maybe like even a lotus leaf tea, something like that. But if I give you that many chickpeas, the point isn't that you're going to think about how good it is to put that many chickpeas in your broth, but you'll consider elevating other broths you make with a few chickpeas, right? Not the big load that I give you, but it's giving you that load that might be the only way to shift you into that possibility of entertaining that umami bracket for your broth. So that is what public intellectuals do. The trouble with this, of course, is that virtually nobody does it decently because people are unethical about what they put into your body. So you can make exaggerations, but they have got to be really intentional, and they have got to never be things that serve you. Right? So what the hell am I talking about when I say a war on Russian soil of only Russians? Is it literally that I'm saying that the imperial war will turn into a civil war? Well, that's not a useless thought. But what I'm really trying to say is we dramatically underestimate how far there is a conflict on that ex-Soviet space between a kind of authoritarian imperial model that needs to be kicked out and replaced by something closer to a modern democratic republic. Not it, but something closer to it. And a lot of the challenges that there are and that we worry about can't really be resolved until this is taken care of on the whole of that space. which means you can't really think about Ukraine, for example, without thinking about Belarus, like thinking of kicking that stuff out of Belarus. Right? Now, the trouble we have got is that, at least to the outsider, it looks much more clearly obvious that the Belarusian people are, to a good extent, just taken hostage by their regime. And that looks less clear when you look at Russia from the outside. But we've got to think about all of this space and kicking something out of it. And that means all kinds of things. It means that we have to, broken record now, reflect on how we can do our bit to politicize that space, not just say, well, Ukraine is on the wrong side of this and that's on the right side of this and that's great, and then let's keep the rest of the stuff out if it's bad. Well, no, we need transformation there. It means that Ukraine thinks about its collegiality with the Belarusian opposition, right? It also thinks about understanding its enemy properly and so on. So all of these sorts of images, that's the direction in which I'm gently trying to tilt us when, in the course of sort of 11 seconds, I say a war of only Russians against Russians, right? There are probably other things to that image, but that's how that works. I said something about how this is a kind of relief for the army. I mean, there are going to be people in the army who sympathize with the old Prigozhin, with the completely out of control outbursts Prigozhin, more than they do with Shoigu and Gerasimov, but we won't get into that conversation. And then I said something about how the Putin regime will increasingly fail to resolve its conflicts in non-fatal means, and that the means will be more terror-like, more fatal, and also increasingly less well controlled, less well vertically controlled. And I suppose what I didn't mention is there a way sort of out of that for the regime? And I don't see one except a scenario where the society militarizes, quote unquote, fascicizes the depoliticized blob in the middle of the population, and gets out of this spiral that way. But that's an outcome that still seems, as much as Mr. Putin aspires toward it in the medium term, less likely.